Welcome to our webinar. My name is Dr. Sherry Popp with Weave Education, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We'll still have people joining for the next couple of minutes, so we'll take care of a few housekeeping items. We are recording this session, and following the event today, those who are registered will receive an email with a recording of the session. We're going to have time for some Q&A at a few select places throughout the webinar, so please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions for our presenters. We'll also have quite a few materials available to share. Jeremy Reich, one of our presenters, has compiled a list of links to some resources that he'll make available to you. So be ready to grab those out of the chat and save those to review later on. With that, we'll get started with our webinar here, and I would like to take a few minutes and introduce our guest speakers for today. Jeremy Reich is the Assessment and Accreditation Coordinator in the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Office of Institutional Effectiveness. Most recently, Jeremy was the Administrative Coordinator at NJIT's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, focused on communications, engagement, and outreach. Jeremy holds a BA in History from Drew University, an MAT in Social Studies from Rutgers University, in Newark, and he recently began a doctoral program. He's going to tell us a little bit more about that journey as the webinar goes on. We're also joined today by Anthony Marziliano. He's joining us with 10 plus years of higher education assessment experience, and he manages all of the assessment workflow and leads in the scholarship and publishing efforts at St. John's University, New York. His research includes higher education assessment, qualitative methods for improved student learning, goal achievement and outcomes, and quantitative statistical analysis of student learning. So we have quite a bit of combined experience here today to share with you some information about how self-reflection prompted a continuous improvement cycle for New Jersey Institute of Technology, and also how that applies to the work that's going on at St. John's University. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our speakers for joining and being willing to talk about your assessment journey. So we have some objectives for today. We're going to seek to understand how to utilize a detailed assessment plan for improvement. That's the kind of the evergreen call in the assessment world, is using the data and the work that we're doing for improvement of student learning. We're going to learn the benefit of assessment development opportunities. There'll be a little focus here on some professional development opportunities. And then talk about acquiring tools to enhance structured assessment plan frameworks. And then also a special focus today, especially if you're joining us from the Middle States region, like Jeremy is, some information about aligning this improvement process with the Middle State standards and priorities. So that'll be a benefit of this session for us. So right now, before we get started and before I hand off the baton here, we're going to launch a poll. And so you'll see that pop up on your screen. And we're just asking how much assessment or institutional effectiveness leadership experience you have. And this is a little bit kind of a segue into part of the story, as Jeremy's going to tell us about how he got started in this role almost exactly 1 year ago today. So we've got those poll results coming in, and it looks like quite a few people with less than 5 years of experience in their role. We have a couple of experienced experts on the call here with more than 10 years of experience. I wish there were names attached to this so I could see those names. Those would be the people I would tap for the next webinar to help us all continue to grow as institutional effectiveness leaders. So we'll leave that open for just another second here. Got a couple more people who might be responding. And so it looks like our largest cohort, and I can share that with you now that we've closed the poll. Our largest cohort are folks who've been in their role for 1 to 5 years. So quite a few folks that I would consider in the new category, several who are less than a year. And so hopefully some of what Jeremy's going to share today from the perspective of a new assessment leader will provide you with some ideas about growing your skill set as you engage in your work as an assessment leader. So I'll stop sharing that, and I'm going to jump out of the way here and hand the baton off to Jeremy.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming, especially those who, like me, are around that 0 to 1 to 1 to 5 mark. I started in my role here at NJIT literally on the 11th of last year, so I just barely am in that second category. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of the context of where NJIT was when I took on the role of assessment coordinator at NJIT. I was actually just moved up to director of assessment, but the same position or same role for assessment. So we had some really, really high turnover for a variety of reasons. The person who was focused on assessment at NJIT at the institutional level was never really focused on assessment for more than a couple of months or a year, the way it turned out. So that was highly problematic. We had the Middle States self-study due for community review in mid-September, and we found that we only had about 25% of our academic programs up to date on assessment. And that was using the definition that a program had been assessed within the last 7 years. That definition will change going forward, but that was what we were working with. We had many programs that had never actually been assessed, especially our certificate programs. We were horrified to find that not a single one of our certificate programs had been assessed at all at any point in time. So that added to that number that's included in what's on screen, which was problematic. And then we had check-in reports as well that had been implemented, but they were very, very basic. In fact, most of what they were asking is, did you follow up on your assessment? Did you do assessments? What did you do? There's nothing more specific than that. So they needed a redesign to better facilitate the continuous improvement process. So between January and September, I had about 7 months to get situated, figure out what was going on, and then actually facilitate the other 75% of those assessments. We can go to the next slide. So the first step was to figure out what was going on. Now, I did have some experience with assessment. I'd say from more of a philosophical level. I was running a K-12 program through grants that NJIT was involved with. I was running a self-assessment program for schools, but I had never done self-assessment, let alone for, or assessment, let alone for the higher education perspective. And I really didn't have the foundational knowledge of what assessment meant in higher education. I have a master's in teaching and social studies, so I get it from the perspective of an educator at that level, but not from a programmatic level. So that was definitely new to me, but I knew assessment was important. And I had that background, so that's why I was recruited to the role. So I need to accomplish a number of things in order to really get myself situated. One was, where were we? What was going on at NJIT as it was? What was the history of that over the last 5 to 10 years? So we could figure out the context of why things were the way they were. What were the Middle States standards and how did they impact assessment? Now, I knew Middle States existed. I knew there were standards. I knew there was accreditation. I just had never bothered to actually look because it wasn't relevant. The context of assessment in higher education, I needed that knowledge. And the first lead course that I took that we're going to be talking about later was really, really fundamental to that. And then based on all of those pulled together, what did I need to update? And more importantly, what compromises could we make given our timeline to get at least a baseline of what we need to do to get all those programs assessed in time for our accreditation crunch, but know also what we want to do, but could tap on to after that. So you can go to the next slide. So where were we? So pre-2019, we had a 5-year cycle, and it had the components like mission, goals, outcomes, measures of assessment to some degree, but they were text-based, they were long, they were sometimes 5, 10, 20 pages long. They had a lot of unnecessary information. They were just really terrifyingly scary, and that's from my perspective, not the one actually writing them. And in the end, they were really inconsistently implemented, which is why we had a lot of programs that weren't assessed by the time I was figuring out where we were. Then my immediate predecessor in the role came in, and she completely revamped the assessment cycle. She built in a 3-year assessment cycle, year 1 being the assessment, year 2 being the analysis of the assessment, and year 3 closing the loop and acting on that analysis. They brought in Weave as an assessment management system, but she was only here a year. And she left, I have no idea why, but we ended up only having about 6 programs out of about 120 assess their programs to a level that was complete upon the standards which they were requested. By the time she left, there were a number of others that were incomplete, but the vast majority of them hadn't even started even that level yet. So you can go to the next slide. So with that in mind, I did a really deep dive into the middle states standards as well. Now, my frustration with the middle state standards, but also the benefit of the middle state standards, is that they are vague and flexible. From an assessment component, if things were a little bit more detailed, it would have made things much easier, but I had what I had. However, middle state does have videos for each of the standards, and my boss jokingly calls them hostage videos, and they are dry, they are very legalistic, but once you get through that, there are tidbits of information that aren't written anywhere else, seemingly, that were very, very helpful in clarifying some of those vague aspects of the standards. So they are worth it. And honestly, there's a lot of formulaic stuff you can just skip through to get to that. But they are helpful. It is worth being taken hostage for at least a little bit from that standpoint. And then getting at the very least anecdotal feedback from program directors who I was able to talk to before really revamping the system, as well as those who are now my supervisors who had done assessment to some degree previously, just to kind of get their perspective on where we were, where we wanted to be from the provost perspective of what we wanted to do with assessment, so that I made sure that I was at the very least not going against what they wanted. And you can go to the next slide, Sherry. So then very fundamental, as I said, and very timely. I was actually just joking with Sherry how timely this was, considering it's been almost exactly a year since I started. I started January 11th of last year, and this course started January 19th. So I was signed up by NJIT for this course. I think it was a 6-week, 8-week course. There's information on that. To gain the foundational knowledge, the academic consensus, as I like to say, on higher education assessments. Now, could have I been all right if I didn't have this? Yeah, if I spent an immense amount of time doing my own research, sure, but I didn't have an immense amount of time. And the resources provided through this course were just an absolute lifesaver. Having the colleagues in the course from other institutions, various different kinds of institutions, and having the instructors, Anthony, which was one of them, really made my life so much easier. And I apologize to both Anthony and Sherry, who were the instructors, on that. I asked a lot of selfish questions as I was literally designing our assessment process in class. So I was a good student, but I wasn't the best student sometimes in that sense. But again, extremely helpful for getting that foundational knowledge. You can click next. So autopsying the actual assessment process as it was. The 3-year, 3-step process was way too restrictive. It did not give anywhere near enough time for program directors to assess. analyze that assessment and actually do something about it before the next assessment came into play. There was also a lot of confusion as why the analysis of the assessment waited until year 2. I see no reason to not just analyze the assessment once you've done the assessment, especially when it's fresh in mind. I mean, with program directors who are faculty who have a lot of other things to do, waiting for them to get, working on other things and forgetting parts of the assessment, it doesn't make sense. Just analyze it once you've done the assessment. So that was a big issue. Program directors needed much more hands-on guidance documentation, direct support and facilitation from my end as the assessment coordinator than what was being previously provided. It was very, very hands-off previously, and I think that had a lot to do with getting only 6 programs that were completed during that time frame. Also, our assessment components, which is what I like to call things like mission statements, program goals, student learning outcomes, measures of assessment, and so on and so forth. They needed set specific definitions. We were not running on any particular definition of what each of those meant, especially within the context of NJIT. So the result was statements throughout programs were really all over the place because it was based on what that particular department or program director decided to do. And I think there was also a marketing aspect to it as well. So they needed those official definitions. They needed key considerations that they can look at for each of those definitions. And those need to be based off of the academic consensus as well as the middle state standards and the context of what we were looking to do at NJIT. And this all needed to be accomplished and everything completed within 7 months, which was rather scary, but it had to be done. So we went and just got started. So really, that's where we were. February 2nd, we launched the effort, and we finished it in December. Note how I said the deadline was September, but we got it done. So Sherry, I will leave it off to Q&A. I see there's also a couple of questions, and we'll dig into resources. I know there's a question about those resources. We'll dig into those in my next portion.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you for the laying out the context for us and reviewing kind of like what happened in those first few months. And I think we can all say congratulations on making it through a year. It's a miracle. So we do have a couple of minutes here for Q&A, and we'll have another opportunity later in the webinar for some further questions, but we'll pause here. And while folks are kind of thinking and maybe formulating some questions, I'll just mention 2 things that stood out to me in that description of NJIT and the context. One is I really appreciate the reference to the videos that Middle States provide. So I think that you'll find that most accreditors provide something along those lines, and we don't always think to go looking on their website for training videos to clarify the issues of what they're looking for standard by standard. And hostage videos made me laugh a little bit, but truly, if they provide like the context or some very specific detail that's helpful to understanding the standards, and that's great. The other thing I heard there is this talk about compromise as you went through this autopsy process and you realized, okay, we have a certain amount of time, we have a certain amount of resources, and there are some choices we have to make about what we can realistically do well, and then what we can delay. And so I'm wondering, Anthony, I'm going to put you on the spot, but maybe you can talk a little bit too about your experience with making those choices and compromises in the assessment cycle.
Yeah, we're going to get a little bit into the assessment cycle in a little while on my end. But in terms of actual compromise, I think that one of the things we have to always be focused on when it comes to kind of getting assessment going across our institutions is figuring out what works for everyone. And, our institutions are unique in that what works for me may not work for Jeremy. So we have to really think about what our faculty need, where our accreditor needs, and then make decisions and changes based on all that. So I think that there's a lot that goes into the idea of compromise, but assessment in many ways is about just that. And we'll talk a little bit about the idea of transparency and then ultimately collaboration in a little while. And that idea of collaboration is really only possible through compromise and assessment. So we have to really think about what works for all of us, but the most important thing is that we're servicing our stakeholders regardless of how we're doing it. We have to make sure that we're giving them what they need.
Great, thank you. So there were a couple of questions in the chat about assessment management systems, and that would be, I'll take that one and say that's Weave. And so we're glad you're here at our webinar today. And if you'd like to know more about the software, there'll be an opportunity at the end of the webinar. There's a QR code that you can scan and you can get more information about Weave from that. We do have another question in the chat. What proportion of programs and departments are accredited by other program accreditors at NJIT, and how did that influence your decisions on how to get others on board of the assessment train?
Yeah, so I will tell you that in a second. I'm just pulling up on the side over here my own dashboard. So we are a Polytechnic STEM institution. So we have many engineering, computer science programs that are externally accredited, at least the bachelor's level programs, the master's, doctorals, for those not so much. So we have about 29 programs that I have that are externally accredited. So actually it's less, and about 120 programs that are not externally accredited. So I guess I usually don't think of it as we internally assess more than we externally accredit, but I guess that is actually the case. Now, the benefit of having any programs externally accredited is those individuals and program directors and departments are much more familiar with the idea of assessment, although at the same time, external accreditation can be really intense. So sometimes having to do it for more programs can be scary. And we try not to be quite that intense. We try to be as efficient and painless as possible. But for, say, like our College of Science and Liberal Arts, where that is much, much rarer, the humanities department does not have any externally accredited programs that I'm aware of at this point. So assessment, if they hadn't done a program assessment under the previous systems, was entirely new to them. So there was quite a bit of an issue with, hey, this is this new thing that you're making me do. Why are you making me do it? And me having to admit to everyone, we should have been doing this for a decade or so. And I can't help that we weren't, but we do have to do it. So there was a lot of additional resistance from those who hadn't dealt with assessment from the external side. And it was much easier to connect the dots for those who were dealing with the external accreditation.
I could just jump in there as well, Jeremy. I think that that's a really, really good point, is the idea that those that have been doing programmatic accreditation or external accreditation outside of the institution can often be your best friends in terms of getting assessment going, because they really understand the process on a different level. You know, they've already done it. The stakes are high in their program, and you know, they understand the accreditation process better than those that are new and ask that question of, why are we doing this? Why are you giving me more work? So those are almost the people you want to go to, right? You kind of know that it'll be easier to get them on your side. They have more work to do oftentimes because they're already doing accreditation and a lot of assessment work, but it's a really good opportunity to get those other folks on the assessment train once you've gotten some that already understand the process to participate as well.
Great. I agree with that completely. They help you get a little traction. If you don't have some, they can be the folks who are the first to speak up. So I want to take this opportunity just for a minute to mention, so Jeremy brought up taking some courses. And so Weave Academy is a professional development opportunity that's available to the higher ed community around training for those in the institutional effectiveness field. So we have interactive courses and workshops on assessment and some more granular things like focus groups and gen ed assessment, those types of things. So at weaveeducation.com, you can find information about the Weave Academy. And one of the unique features of that is these are not asynchronous. They're not MOOCs. They are intended for small groups to come together as a community of practice. We use some of the best practices literature in the industry, and then come together to discuss and work on projects that actually have immediate application at your institution. And that's part of what Jeremy is sharing with us today, is the opportunity that he had to actually dig into an assessment project, rework it, and then take that back as kind of his template for what was going to happen at NJIT following that. So we'll go from here to, I'm going to hand it back off to Jeremy here to continue on, and then he'll pass off to Anthony after this. But I think that he's got several links and examples of things to share with you all.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to tag on to that last point. If you have the time to leverage those program directors who have experience with assessment, to work with them as champions, absolutely do it. We did not have the time to do that, so the pain was a little bit more on my end, but by all means, I highly recommend that. So I do have a link to resources at this tiny URL, NJIT assessment resources. I'll put that in the chat in a bit as well. I didn't think we'd do that earlier. That has perhaps an excessive amount of links to resources. Everything that I have developed for our program directors for our processes over the last year is linked in that document, as well as examples of some things that aren't necessarily public. I just want to talk a second before I start going into these links about the transparency framework. Now, if you're in assessment and you don't know NILOA, you should absolutely check out NILOA, great resources on that website. I imagine most of you are familiar with NILOA. They have a transparency framework, which has about 6 components of being transparent about assessments and the results of assessments. Now, the reality is we only really hit 2 of those. Having somewhere where there is information about our assessment processes and the documents for, and including some students in it. But we really have a long way to go. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the rest of these. And again, all this and much more is available in this tiny URL. And again, I'll pop that into the chat in a bit. So one of my big projects was redesigning the NJIT assessment website. Actually, the most recent update was this morning ahead of this webinar. So we have a main website that is really general for all stakeholders about assessment at NJIT in general, with resources that I particularly like that came through actually the coursework, with tools about assessment, but with specific stakeholders in mind, so faculty, students, affairs. There's also others, but I included these here and didn't want to clutter it too much. As well, so more generic information. But really, it's the academic programs page that's really relevant for here. There'll be a general education page. There will be a support services page, but we're not there yet. We are the farthest along in academic assessments. And so we have now, as a result of going through our whole assessment process, we now have a 4-year assessment cycle with 5 steps. And we chose 4 years because, and I don't know if this is official yet, but the understanding was Middle States was going to an 8-year cycle. So the idea is we finish 2 complete cycles for every program of assessment and improvement within one of those accreditation cycles. It might not be a thing. I can't find any information, but that's what I was told by my supervisors. So solving that issue of not having enough time that I referenced earlier to act upon assessments, we have the full assessment report, which happens in year 1, and I work with program directors on that to create that report based on data, gather that data, and then it goes to the chair and dean for approval. Now, one of the compromises we made was taking out the chair and dean approval this year. That will be included starting, I believe, this semester, but including those over the last year for the 90 programs we had to do it wasn't going to happen. It does go, each assessment report, to an assessment committee that we have that's based under our faculty senate, and they are a cross-section of departments across the university, as well as the support units, some of the higher administration units like the provost office, undergraduate groups, graduate groups, so on and so forth. And they are really fantastic because they provide feedback from that cross-section, some of which completely off of my radar, especially as a new assessment coordinator. There's a lot of policies that I am just woefully unaware of that, having the vice provost for undergraduate programs in the group is really helpful for, and the graduate one as well. But they're also really a good quality assurance mechanism. Some faculty members who are program directors, especially ones who haven't done assessment before, getting them to engage no matter how much you try may not be successful. And this was a really good tool for those few cases where instead of me, some random administrator saying, hey, you've got to do this, they come back and assist with that and provide feedback that's more helpful from their perspective. So that's really helpful. We don't like to use the hammer too much, but it's there if we absolutely positively do that. Thank you, Sherry. That is the link. The action planning also happens in year one. As soon as the program is approved, we move into the action planning process. So any outcome where a measure of assessment didn't necessarily hit the benchmark and the target, those were brought into the action plan, and we work with the program director to create a group of key faculty that we call the action planning team to review specifically those items and determine what we can do to potentially improve those outcomes, draft an action plan, get that approved by the chair and dean, which we are actually doing this year as well, submit it to the provost and the assessment committee as FYIs, and then implement that over the next 3 years. And then each year over the next 3 years, we do a check-in report that just brings in the data from the last year, and we meet for maybe an hour, see how we're doing, and make any adjustments as we see fit, if necessary at all. Otherwise, just keep on chugging. One thing that I'm thinking about, but we haven't really decided upon, is maybe thinning out those check-in reports. So they're not every single year, but we don't really know. We haven't even done a single check-in yet under this model, so we've got a long time to go to do that. We also have all of the information, perhaps too detailed, of each of the areas of assessment and those resource documents. So all of the documents that are in that link that I provided are here except for the mock dashboard. So the assessment components were rewritten, and these were often rewritten on the side screen in class in the first course. So every single aspect that is in our assessment template that I'll show you in a moment is included and defined in here. Every single minute detail has that definition based off the middle state standards and what we learned in class and academic consensus. You could also consider these key considerations, whether, for example, the mission statement is publicly available, as sort of a running checklist rubric, which is very helpful for seeing, hey, where are we with this particular component and what do we need to work on? And that is for everything. This is the one for the academic assessment process. I have one of these for you for each of the action planning, check-in reports, as well as, no, those are the things. There's not another one. I always like threes. So we do have templates. Now this happens to be a filled in template. I have blank templates as well available for the assessment, the check-in, the action planning. I basically made up a program that we don't have at NJIT and probably won't have anytime soon to use as a very overly detailed example. This was something that was really heavily requested by program directors last year. The problem was we hadn't done them, so there was no example to provide. And the examples that we were getting in, because it was the first year doing it, they weren't the best they could be, but they were something. So this is really to remedy that and provide something that's more towards the quote unquote perfection of what we're looking for. So providing them initial data about enrollment graduation, having an initial data analysis, mission statement outcomes, and everything's really organized. Now, we do have Weave as an assessment management system, and this is also one of the compromises that we had to make. I like Weave. I love Weave's PD, but training both myself and 90 program directors on utilizing Weave was just not feasible at this time. So this template was my sort of stop break. It's actually in Word documents for most of the program directors. It's only in here for your accessibility. but this has the same components. It achieves a similar goal, but the management system becomes me. So having an actual management system is much easier. Highly recommend it. This is only a stopgap. That model project that Sherry was mentioning earlier in the first MEAD course, both courses that I've been in so far have a sort of capstone project that is extraordinarily relevant to assessment itself. And the project for that first course was taking a program and revising its assessments based on what we learned. Now, I did this for the BA in history program because I have 2 history degrees. Ignore the fact that I wrote BS here because we mostly have BS programs. It's like the one BA program that we have. I only noticed that today. So we took, for example, this very long-winded, very history-minded mission statement and consolidated it into something that was much more succinct based off of the assessment components as they had been written, plus what we learned in class, with the benefit of having Sherry and Anthony providing feedback as well as feedback from the classmates. And we have a whole document based off of this. And the cool thing is that the history program might actually use it as a reference, which was not necessarily intended, but is really awesome that that work is going to have some real live effort. I believe some of the other classmates who were in my class that particular round actually worked with their programs that they were working with this on. Just the timeline I had, that wasn't feasible, but it's a really great opportunity to take each of these and get very detailed feedback and honestly to get comfortable with the process of doing it. Being able to take something that I knew about conceptually and implement this process made me much more comfortable when I was talking about civil engineering or chemistry, which I knew virtually nothing about concept-wise, and working with program directors who had that knowledge to achieve this. Get out of my way. So something that I've also included that I think is really, really necessary and literally just got on our website today because it's finally been completed, is taking the guidance for mission goals, outcomes, and those components one step further and providing guidance on how to write those. Now, if you look for writing academic program mission statements, you'll find something that looks like very similar or almost exactly like this out there. It's harder to find ones for goals and outcomes, but I have those written as well. I built those and actually did so within the context of the second MEAD course. So I did the exact same thing where I was building the next steps within the course. And part of my other stopgap, which an actual management system like Weave does on its own, but I had to build just to get things moving, was a dashboard for facilitating the assessments. Now, Anthony will talk about the importance of facilitation, but being there, it's my job to run assessment at NJIT. A program director is teaching courses, doing research, other service, possibly more likely advising. There's quite a few things on their plate, and assessment is only but one thing. So making sure that I know where things stand and what the next steps are, and being able to check in with support offers and reminders is really, really important. My supervisor called me relentless, which I believe was a compliment. But just making sure that things are running smoothly. If I wasn't doing that, I think things would have dropped the ball quite a bit. I think being a bit hands-off was one of the reasons that we didn't really have a high rate of assessments being completed previously. So we really took that to the nth degree as far as being up to date with all of our program directors and making sure we were even in contact with them and so on and so forth. So in the document, which a lot of you have open, it seems, I have my contact information. I could spend hours going into detail in each assessment component that nobody wants to be here for hours towards the end of the day. Feel free to reach out to me with questions. I'm more than happy to help. Everything is linked here. If for some reason you have a problem getting to something, let me know. And the reality is everything is a living document here. I'm sure by the time next week comes, I will have made some tweak to some document for some guidance based on the next steps. Everything is really moving forward. I'm always about a step ahead of everyone else. And that is it for me on that section. So I will hand it off to Anthony now.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. Sherry, you could actually just go right to the slides here. Excellent. So we've heard a lot already today about continuous quality improvement, essentially. Maybe not with that term directly, but a cycle of improvement or a cycle of assessment. So some of you know this term, CQI. It's a really important term to us in higher ed assessment. We really like this definition of an ongoing and cyclical manner of assessing student outcomes for the purpose of unending improvement. And I would draw your attention there to that those last two words, unending improvement, which is really our primary focus in our first Weave course that we teach through Weave Academy, is this idea of always making sure that we're focusing on improvement in assessment. And when we feel like we've improved enough, it's time to raise the bar and try to improve some more. So it's really important that we view this in assessment as a critical piece of our process. Not only that it is cyclical, but that the cycle results in improvement and continues to result in improvement as we move forward. So we're going to dig deeper into some of these efforts here in a moment, but it's important to remember and to think of the CQI process as something that needs to be measurable, needs to be cyclical, and needs to be transparent. All assessment processes have to really be pulling from those three specific efforts. And what I'd like you to do is, in terms of a challenge, I'd like you to think about this third one, this idea of transparency. Transparency tends to be the more difficult piece of these three for us in assessment. We often know that we need to measure things. We know that there has to be some type of cycle, whether it's an accreditation cycle or a program review cycle or whatever it may be. But very often we find ourselves stuck behind our desks or behind our laptops, not sharing information well enough. So I would challenge you to think about that transparent process. And we're going to talk a little bit about communication and collaboration in a moment, and how those two ideas really kind of work toward a successful CQI process. But really think about transparency and how you can be more transparent as your institutions as we move forward here in the next 20 minutes. Okay, Sherry, you can go to the next slide there. So this is a really good example of the assessment cycle as we see it in higher ed. And I'm going to take you through the cycle here. And then what I'll do is I'll take you through these cycle elements on the right side of your screen as well. But the most important thing before we do any of that is the idea that your outcomes, that blue box at the top of the cycle, your outcomes have to be measurable. And we talk about a lot of this, and Jeremy's heard this plenty in the first course, and I'm sure in the second course as well. But the establishment of learning outcomes is critical as the first stage of your assessment process. Those outcomes have to be measurable. If you're writing outcomes that cannot be measured or aren't measurable, or you can't identify how you would measure them, then it's time to rethink those outcomes. It's time to either rewrite them or go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what your outcome should be and how it should read. So in terms of the actual cycle, you'll establish your learning outcomes. You will, after making sure that they are measurable, you'll identify what those measures are. You'll also identify criteria for success, which essentially are your targets. So for those of you that are familiar with Weave language, you know that you'll have measures and you'll have targets for those measures, which is what you're aiming for. Once you've established those targets, you will assess your student learning. You'll collect your data and you'll determine whether or not your targets have been achieved and whether or not those measures helped you figure out what needs to change and what needs to be done. You'll view and discuss those results with your stakeholders. That's that transparent discussion process. And then ultimately, and most importantly, you'll use your results for improvement. And you see that that leads back to establishing learning outcomes. Once you've decided what needs to be improved and you've used your results for improvement, it's time to take it back to the beginning and re-examine your learning outcomes. And when you're first learning assessment, that can be a daunting idea, that this is kind of a continuous process. But what it does is it allows us to move toward making sure that we are always improving student learning and not getting stagnant in our assessment processes. So what I'll take you through here on the right side is just some elements from the assessment cycle, and specifically this example here on your screen of really what's important in terms of working through that cycle and making sure that you stick to the really important pieces of it. We talked about making sure your outcomes are measurable, obviously really critical, but it's important to build those measurable outcomes around organized structures. We call them matrices. A matrix is really just a surrounding structure. It could be a chart, could be a spreadsheet, a form, honestly, whatever works for your institution in terms of organizing things. It doesn't matter what it is as long as it's organized. The whole process, that whole matrix process has to be data driven. As long as data is flowing into those charts or those matrices, you're going to be able to build measurable outcomes and track whether or not those outcomes are successful. You'll also plan for cyclical data presentation. Again, this is that challenge I gave you, right? The idea of transparency. How are you going to present this cyclical data? Once you get yourself to a point where you find yourself presenting cyclical data, whether it's through an annual report or monthly assessment updates or maybe semesterly, you're going to end up with stakeholders that expect to see data in routine intervals. And while that may be a daunting idea, oh no, now they expect to see this, it actually is really important to help grow your culture of assessment. Because what you're doing is you're setting up a scenario where you have faculty, students, alumni, whoever the stakeholder group we're talking about is, and ideally all of your stakeholder groups that are actually looking for information from you, waiting for that report, waiting to see what the update is. What does retention look like? What does attrition look like? Things of that nature. It also helps you and your group remember to stick to the continuous quality process. Once you've set yourself up with a cycle of presentation, you know that you have to do it. It allows us as assessment folks to make sure that we're continuously presenting data, that we're staying on top of what needs to happen. I don't need to tell a lot of folks here on this webinar to be accreditation aware, but I want you to be accreditation aware when it comes to your assessment cycle. Accreditation can help guide your cycle, particularly in how the cycle operates and flows and what edits to your specific cycle need to be made. And of course, this is a really good example, but every institution is going to have their own unique spin on what the assessment cycle looks like based on needs. Assessment, though, is driven oftentimes by accreditation, as we know. So accreditation will help guide that process and how specifically your results are going to be used for improvement. You're also going to collect data and produce reports that maintain interoperability across your institution. What I mean by that is you want to report on data that works hand in hand with other institutional units. One of the first things you should do when you start working on assessment in an institution is make sure that you understand what assessment reports and what data is collected across the institution. Not only to make sure you're not doing double work, but also to make sure that you're collecting data and producing reports that can work with those other units and hand in hand achieve common goals. And then finally, maintaining transparency. As we said, you should be maintaining transparency across all stakeholder groups to ensure that you are actually sharing what's happening and everyone is on the same page. Sherry, you can go to the next slide here. We'll talk a little bit about communication. As we mentioned early on, collaboration and communication are the two items here for CQI. You want to make sure you're communicating all the time, continuously. Report to all stakeholders. They should be hearing from you as assessment routinely. A lot of times we leave a stakeholder group out in the cold, and that stakeholder group oftentimes is students. They're your most important group. You need to make sure you're telling them what's happening and what the data says and what change, if any, are taking place. It seems like common sense, but we often forget to share that information. Put this on your calendar, put it into Outlook reminders, wherever your eyes are trained to look. Make sure that you are training yourself and your data people to share results with stakeholder groups as you see fit. Shared drives, cloud services, whatever works for you. Central file sharing for assessment projects is essential. This really plays into keeping faculty informed in the process. The last thing you want is a group of faculty that don't know what's happening or aren't aware of what's going on. So make sure that you have a central file sharing process in place, again, whatever works. And think about the story you're trying to tell. Always ask yourself as an assessment person or as an assessment group, how does this specific assessment lead to improvement? The answer has to be there. You have to be able to point to where a specific assessment can lead to improvement. If you can't point to that, chances are the assessment either is redundant or doesn't need to be done anymore, and maybe it can be shifted or changed to something else that would or could lead to improvement. Can the specific assessment be sustained? And can the cycle be sustained? That's really important as well. And then ultimately, how should information be shared? Are you sending PDFs around? Are you putting data into the body of an email? Are you having town halls? Again, what works for your institution or your program can change and should change, but it's really important to make sure that this communication is happening. What's the best way to tell your story? Those are questions you should ask yourself as a group, as an institution, and make sure that you're actually communicating in ways that your stakeholder groups would best be served. And then finally, collaboration. We know that increased communication ultimately leads to collaboration. And this is my preferred term rather than faculty buy-in, which we're trying to get away from that idea. We're trying to talk about collaboration and making sure we get faculty to work with us. And that really ultimately looks like grassroots involvement, right? We want to make sure that we're asking stakeholders what is needed. Surveying your faculty, surveying your students. What do you need from us? What's the best way to make sure that we're improving? Ultimately, one of the best ways to do that is lowering the barrier to actual involvement. You should be everywhere with everyone, collaborating on every level that you can. Assessment professionals should be omnipresent, should be at every event possible. You should be at town halls. You should know what's going on in every different area. Oftentimes we hear from assessment professionals, well, I'm not involved in that. That's not really assessment. Assessment is everything. You should be involved with every single part of your institution, or at least know what's happening. And then when you can, get away from the stick and move toward the carrot. Assessment and accreditation are always going to be connected at the hip here, specifically whether through accreditation, that stick is always in play. We don't need to lean on it all the time. As Jeremy mentioned, there are times where we can lean on it, but we can often get away with offering something to faculty in return to increase that collaboration and that collaborative environment. So always, move toward that reward. That's something to give to faculty as opposed to, chasing them around with the stick, which is accreditation. So collaboration, communication, really important parts of the CQI process. I'm going to hand this back over to Jeremy just to wrap up here with the few minutes we have left.
Yeah, so thank you. And there's one thing I kind of just want to add. I forgot to mention it earlier, but for those NJIT program directors, especially who might be on here, and I think this is also a good note for everyone, is one of the compromises that we made with the assessment data that we used for learning outcomes. So in class, you'll hear it over and over in the head, direct and indirect assessment measures and data. And we found that in our timeline, we had to use grade data for courses connected to specific learning outcomes as our measure of assessments, because that's what we had access to, which is indirect and by no means best practice. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But it was either that or ask hundreds of instructors and faculty to go into their classes and collect data over the last 5 years retroactively, which was just unfeasible. Our deadline self-imposed was September. We didn't finish until December, so it just simply wasn't going to happen. So what we ended up having to do was at that little blue box for creating outcomes. We used the outcomes and goals that we had pre-prepared, whatever existed. We utilized that because we had it. We used the grade data. We had it, but we used it as a canary in the coal mine. So essentially what we did is, instead of looking at direct assessment measures that led us directly to where continuous improvement was potentially needed, was we were able to at the very least say, hey, this class is an outlier. Let's talk about why once we get to the action planning process. So kind of distribute that later. But the use of grade data was a big concern for program directors, for the assessment committee, and frankly for us. But we could provide it. So that was probably the biggest compromise that we made in our scaffolding efforts. So that really leads to, actually, I do want to answer one question first that came in from Megan on the data we share. So we share, in our assessment, in our assessment template, we have two levels of assessment. One is very high programmatic levels. That is where the retention and graduation rates, that sort of really high level data comes in. And actually in the future, we'll be adding that for women and underrepresented minorities for our DEI efforts as well, but we did include that this year. And then the second section is our outcomes-based assessment, which is the major component of it. So that's we're dealing with very specific student learning aspects based on the goals and the outcomes of the program. And this time, especially because of the nature of doing it very quickly and not having the most adequate outcomes, goals, and mission statements at the time, a lot of the changes were structural as far as the curriculum and items within the courses and how they were structured together. So that was pretty much every program that we've had that conversation with. It was, hey, this program, there was literally a certificate program that was titled X, and one of the elective courses was also titled X. It was literally the content for that program. Nobody who took that certificate program took that course, so they had to make a change to make that one of the required courses. That's an extreme example, but there were a lot of other curricular changes that are coming down the pipeline like that. And as we go further down the line and revise our mission goals and outcomes, that will be something that we'll start diving deeper into the course level with. So hopefully that answers your question, Megan. So where are we now? What's the results? So it is January. We have our self-study due to middle states in about 2 weeks. And 100% of our programs are up to date on assessment using that old 7-year model. Everyone who needs to do a check-in report has their check-in reports in. We're 100% there. And we are currently in the early stages of working with program directors and key faculty on creating action plans based on those assessments. And that's where a lot of the results that we're seeing are at the very high curricular level, or at the very least, the structure of the course itself. Just completed as of mid-December, that second weave course. And now we are going on to move into assessment of the general education program with that particular subcommittee. We are working on support services, which we'll be doing in the summer, because that also needs a pretty significant revamp that will be actually based on what we did for the academic assessment program. So GER is its own beast. That's going to be treated very differently, but the support services model will basically be an adaptation of what we've done for the academic program, so perhaps less intensive. Revision and refinement of mission goals and outcomes is something that's really big. So I've mentioned probably a couple of times at this point that the outcomes and mission statements that we had were not really ideal for the purposes of assessment, because frankly, assessment wasn't really on front of mind for many departments and programs. So in order to take the new and we didn't have definitions, so that didn't help either. So now that we do have those definitions, those considerations, as part of every single program's action plan by default, actually in the template as we have it right now, is the revision and refinements of the mission statements, the goals, the outcomes, and then going down to the measures of assessment, the benchmarks and targets, mapping the curriculum, all the way down the line. In fact, that process has been greatly informed by the second weave course, especially when dealing with curriculum mapping aspect of that. That's a huge and very helpful thing that we're in the process of designing now. I'm sorry I don't have any resources for that. They are still in the process of being developed because that is really the next step. Based on NJIT's request and actually funding, I'm doing an EDD program at FDU where I will be getting my EDD higher education and getting a really thorough understanding of the general context of higher education. Right now, I'm a pure facilitator. I rely 100% on the program directors and those I work with to have a contextual understanding and the experience needed. Really, that's what we should rely upon mostly anyway. We should really be telling them what to do. But having that knowledge and that background from that program is going to be very helpful, because then maybe I can add much more to the conversation besides, hey, let me help you get this done, which is the very short, ill-defined version of what I'm doing now. So we're we're going into the next round of our program assessment. We did 90 to get to 100% in the last round, and now we have another 30 programs that were in the check-in phase previously or are now technically out of date that we'll be doing this year. We expect with the 4-year cycle to do about 30 program assessments in a given year. We're going to try and really split that between the different programs and departments so that even at the department level, it's really spread out across that 4 years of when we're doing full assessments compared to action planning and check-in reports. And really, the big thing is determining the mechanism for connecting in-course learning management system data to the assessment mechanism. We know there's stuff out there. We're very, very early on in this, but making it so that next time we do an assessment that we're not asking instructors to manually, retroactively collect data, that we can really perhaps even facilitate that collection of data is really a big focus of ours. We really want to make sure that our assessment processes are effective, efficient, beneficial, and as painless as humanly possible. And that really falls upon me to figure out how to best do that. And then if you could just go to the next slide. And this is actually the result of the project that came out of the second course. And this is something we'll be implementing once we finish these next 30 programs. So next year is a plan for assessing our assessment process now that we've actually built our assessment process going forward. So the first assessment of the previous plans was really hey, we need to get this done in 7 months. What can we do? What can't we do? Let's get this done, basically working back on a timeline. This is a much, much more formalized start to a plan for reassessing and reevaluating. We have made updates to the assessment process and tools continuously over the last year based on what we learned as we were going. And this is very much a much more formalized version of that using survey and focus group data from program faculty. So that is where we are going forward, and hopefully things will be slowing down in my life now when it comes to assessment.
Well, one can only hope for that. So wonderful. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I like to say all the time in Weave Academy courses is that we in the assessment business are in the R&D business, which is not research and development. It's rip off and duplicate. And we really appreciate, Jeremy, you sharing all of those resources because folks can then dive in and borrow pieces and contextualize them and make them their own. And that's really one of the wonderful things about the assessment community as a whole is the willingness to collaborate and to share. And I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share some insights. Two of the pieces that I really appreciated, Jeremy, sharing all of those resources in an effort to build what I like to call assessment literacy at your institution. And it's really the foundational piece. It's where we all have to start, is to build a common language and a common understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. And you've got all those resources now to help the folks at your institution who have to do this work get on the same page and kind of rowing in the right direction. And then Anthony mentioned about folks presenting the data to the point where people are now expecting that and coming and asking you for that. And I think maybe that could be everybody's measure of success, right? Like when's the first time somebody actually came up to you and said, hey, remember you're supposed to get us an assessment report. Then you know you've got a culture of assessment, right? That's when you know you've got it made. So we are just a couple of minutes past the hour. I know some folks are starting to drop off here and we want to be respectful of time. If you have questions, you can still pop those in the chat for the next minute or two. If we can't answer them live, we'll be happy. I'll grab those and we'll respond to you in email. I do want to take a second and talk just a little bit about Weave. There were some questions in the chat regarding assessment management systems, and Weave is a comprehensive institutional effectiveness platform that will accommodate so much of this work that Jeremy and Anthony were talking about today, from the annual assessment cycle, goals, outcomes, measures, and findings, but also curriculum mapping and those program reviews that happen on a cycle. We have the capability for custom templates for those program reviews. So if you would like to know more about Weave, just reach out to me at sherry@weaveeducation.com. We're happy to provide that information. You will receive an email with the recording of today's session following this. It'll probably follow in a day or two after that video processes. And in the meantime, you can check out our Knowledge Center. We have a wealth of other resources, webinars, and articles, including our brand new podcast that is launching this month. So we would love to have you subscribe to our podcast. The first episode features CHIA president. And so those are coming soon. And finally, Jeremy was very gracious in mentioning several times his experience with Weave Academy, and we would love to have you join us for a Weave Academy event. We have several things coming up in the near future, courses launching. We do have Weave members only workshops. So for those of you who are Weave members, look for those in our Weave connections and join us for the workshops. We will have our next webinar on March 1st, featuring Cameron University, who achieved the Excellence in Sustained Assessment recently from NILO, and they'll be talking to us about their assessment processes. So you can grab that QR code there too to find out more about Weave. So that's a little bit of the shout out. I don't know if there are any questions coming in the chat that we need to field there. It sounds like maybe we're not. So again, Anthony, Jeremy, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to share this wealth of resources with our listeners.
Appreciate it. Nice to be with everybody today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you all for taking the time to join us. Looks like we've got
you got one question.
We do. How to obtain a Weave certification, and that would be through our courses. And if you grab that QR code there, it'll take you to the website, or you can just go to weaveeducation.com, and we would love to see you in a course. You can also just reach out to me with those questions. So thank you, everyone. We will hopefully see you in a future Weave event.